I'm Vivian Porritt, and I'm delighted to join this week-long conference. I think that's a new idea, a new way of working. And I want to explore what it does actually mean to be a leader. And I particularly want to focus on how we can all support diverse and inclusive leadership, and particularly that of the leadership of our female colleagues. I hope somebody would let me know if that hasn't come through as a full screen. So is that okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much. So as Lizana mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders and global strategic leaders of an organisation called Women Ed. Our role is, as it says on the tin, connect existing and aspiring women leaders in what we now describe as global education, because we have grown in a way that we had never thought would happen for a group of us who simply wanted to make a difference for women on Twitter. So I'll let you see the size of the difference after that. I want to just start by thinking what it does actually mean to be a leader. And unusually for me, what I actually want to start with is what should it not mean? So what I'd love you to do very, very quickly is, can you put into the chat one word, try and limit yourself to one word that would describe one of the poor leaders that you've ever had. So I don't want to start with what makes a leader great. I want to start with what makes a leader be a very poor leader. One of those leaders that people find impossible to work with. So can you just put some words in? Bossy, dishonest, micromanager, what else have we got going on? A bully, some awful words to describe what a leader should not be. And I want to start there, because if we know what we shouldn't be, I wonder if that helps us as leaders know what we can be, what we want to be. And I get obsessed in education by people thinking that leaders are doers all the time. I know the time in education can mean we don't get enough time to think, but I'm asking you all, in where you are now in a celebratory moment of your career, to start thinking less about what should I do, but to start thinking about what kind of a leader should I be? How should I be as a leader? And I just want to share some of the ways in which I would interpret that. So what should it mean to be able to talk about how you are as a leader, how you will be? So I'm starting with some examples. The wonderful Michelle Obama. Now, I always think when we talk about diversity that she doesn't look like a leader at times. She doesn't look like the stereotypical view of a leader. She's very happy to be glamorous. She's very happy to be dressed down. She's very happy to be serious, but she's so much happier when she's smiling. And I think that captures that a leader there is somebody who is being who she does want to be, using Alana's point earlier. And so how would this leader be? How was this leader in the way he was being for other people? He was standing up for people. He was being representative. He was being honest. He was being true. And he was resilient in holding on to what he knew were the truths and the rights for the rest of his people. Is that the kind of leader you want to be, using those kind of adjectives? And what about this leader? How would we describe how she would be as a leader? Quiet, relentless, but not extrovert, simply focused on doing the job she needed to do for a long time, never letting go, never giving up. And this leader, full of passion for his end goal and what he wants to achieve, a brilliant communicator, because his passion is the way he communicates, the way he shares his knowledge, the way he calls us to action. And normally I would stop there, but I've added another. So this is a leader whose being is with his troops, with his colleagues, with his citizens. I loved some of the images where you saw Zelensky having his meal, sat at a rough table with the people who were fighting. He's not a leader who is whisked out to a comfortable situation. He's there, he's living it, he's supporting, he's helping. Those are my examples of what being a leader could mean. And I would really love you to think about, how will I be as a leader, rather than what will I do? And we empower women to think that way much more than we feel is the kind of the current advocacy around leadership. We want that to shift and change. And we want to empower more women in education to progress into leadership journeys. There are significant disparities among the number of female leaders compared to male. And even if, for example, in primary schools, there are very many more women leaders, the proportion of men becoming leaders is out of all proportion compared to their number in their workforce. So you've got an amazing chance to be a male head teacher in primary, because you are going to progress more quickly than women. I don't know if that's because you're more rare, but there is definitely that imbalance. And there certainly is in secondary schools, and it's even worse in universities and further education. So we want to focus on supporting women so that we have a better balance, better diversity, and we have therefore a greater advantage in education to make it more effective for an organisational approach, but also for the benefit of our students. We're a values-driven organisation. We have 8 C's, and part of our work, we believe, is always to give utter clarity about the issues in education. And in education, women are not represented in senior leadership posts according to the proportion of their number of women in the workforce. There is a significant disparity. And if you then move to women of colour, or women who are disabled, or women who are of a varied sexual orientation, or women who are older as leaders, there is not parity and there is not fairness in some of that way of working. And I came into education because I believed it was an equitable, fair profession. And unfortunately, Women Ed have found and discovered that there's a lot of inequity for women. Now, I don't want to put the women in the group off in terms of being leaders. I want all of us, men and women, to work collaboratively together to address this issue so that our students are able to benefit from greater gender equity. As I said, we started on Twitter, and we now have 37 global networks across nearly all of the continents. We're talking with people in Rwanda at the moment, which would leave only the South Americas to go after that. So there's clearly a need for women in education to feel better supported, better developed, and certainly better recognised. We tackle these barriers through our 4 campaigns. And we are significantly wanting to give clarity about the issues here. So there is a gender pay gap, for example, and it wasn't until after I became a head teacher and then worked in a university and then started thinking about this that I actually discovered we had one. And that's not acceptable to me, and I know it's not acceptable to everyone in the organisation. We're very delighted as Women Ed that what we've now achieved through the pay gap report that we shared there is that the Department for Education is now saying there has been a pay gap between male and female leaders over the last 10 years because of the leadership pay gaps that are inadequate and unacceptable. So I think being a leader is about fairness, about being equitable, about being honest and transparent, and about seeing, and about a leader who, if they see something wrong, something inequitable, they want to do something about it. And that would be my request of all of you here today, in whatever role you can take. And if you want to know more about Women Ed, we've written 2 books where we go into the depth of all of that. And we want to disrupt the status quo. There's too much in education as leadership where you do what other leaders have always done. So I also want you as a leader to be brave and to dismantle the status quo where you can see it's wrong. And if that's in the representation of women, or the representation of women from underrepresented groups, or more advocacy for flexible working, or to absolutely smash the gender pay gap, then we have to be brave and we have to move forward, all of us, men and women, and address the wrongs that are happening at the moment in education for very many women. And I want to stop there and just reiterate that what I would love you to do as you move through your leadership journey is to think more about what kind of a leader will I be, as opposed to what kind of a leader, what should I do as a leader? Think about how you should be as a leader. And please, where we see inequity in education, please can we work collaboratively to address it. Thank you very much, Lizana.
Thanks so much, Vivian. And in the beginning, I forgot to say many congratulations on your OBE as well, because I haven't spoken to you very recently to say that. So wonderful news and congratulations on that for all the work you're doing.
Thank you. And while it was wonderful personally, what was even more wonderful is that it was for the impact of Women Ed. So that gives us that galvanizes us even more to address these inequities for our female colleagues, because I know no one in education would want that. And once we know they're there, then we're all complicit if we don't address them together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And now it's time for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put your hand up and we will then make sure that you are able to ask Vivian. Vivian, I know that it was also International Women's Day on the 8th. I was trying to time it so that we could coincide, but it didn't quite work that way.
No, I was already booked.
You were, absolutely. But we're delighted that you're here. And I shall also send you an email to ask if you would like to write something for our blog that we can share out as well. I can see that Julia has a hand up. Julia.
Thank you very much, Vivian. That was lovely, really interesting. And my question is, of the 4 campaigns, which is the one that is giving you the most trouble, as in, which is the one that is really challenging the organisation, which is the one that you are having to fight even harder for?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Julia, because of course each one of those campaigns is interlinked. in that one, if we can solve this one, it would help that one. And it's quite hard to pin them down in that way. At the very precise moment we've been very exercised by the gender pay gap, because we're coming up to a new period of reporting. Organisations have to get their gender pay gap data in by April. WomenEd and ASCO and NAHT and the National Governance Association wrote a report, which I highlighted in my presentation, that looked at the latest data and did a really detailed analysis of what that said about the gender pay gap. And I was shocked. Most people are shocked when they read it to see. They're shocked to see that women who are mothers in education have a significant motherhood penalty. In education, for goodness sake. They're shocked to see that men who become head teachers and at age 60 or over on average have a £17,500 gender pay gap per year on average. And that is massive. And then, of course, that affects women's pensions after working a lifetime. So if you think of how much that gap is over 40 years, then that's a significant shift to the pension. So while sorting out the gender pay gap might not have an impact on the other campaigns, I think if women felt more valued and understood that they were being treated equitably and with fairness, I think we might hang on to more women who would stay in the profession. But it's wrong and it's inequitable, and I need everybody's voices behind that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Viv. And we also have Sean Starr, who's got his hand up. Sean, over to you.
Hello, Sean.
Hello there. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I have one question. I appreciate there's probably not one simple answer, so it may be a bit of an unfair question. What one thing is a barrier to stop the representation of women in leadership roles, particularly in primary, for example, where you said that they're the dominant workforce within primary education, but they're not getting to the leadership. What's stopping that?
Well, there are very many more female head teachers than male head teachers in primary, but proportionately they're not balanced. Okay. So men in primary schools are 15% of the workforce, yet they are 26% of head teachers, and they get to be head teachers quicker, and they earn more than the female head teachers. So all of that is still wrong, even in primary.
Of course.
Yeah. So what was the question, Sean?
Sorry. What's stopping that?
All right. Yes. Yeah. So what's stopping? There are 3 or 4 really key reasons, but I would finally put it down to bias.
Okay.
Now that's conscious bias. Or unconscious bias, or what another colleague who works in BAME Ed and Women Ed, Penny, would say, inherent bias. We are all biased in some ways, and so it's about the mix of that kind of bias and stereotyping, which is the same side of bias. Unless we start unpicking how we make some of these decisions, like recruitment decisions or pay decisions, or whether somebody gets flexible working request agreed, all of those decisions are influenced by the bias of whatever kind we hold. Now, that's going to take years, millennia to change. So a quicker one is to do some very small things, such as with the gender pay gap. If everybody removed the current question from their application form, that would help the gender pay gap, because there is nothing in the person spec that says you have to be cheap. So it's an equitable question. I don't know what it's there for. We don't have set pay scales like we used to have. So remove that and that will help. So we talk about the big systemic issues like bias, and then we do some really small practical things that people can do as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Viv. I have a question, if I can ask that, that'd be great. I would like you just to explain a little bit more about the Women-Ed motto, the 10% braver motto that we have, and also just tell us a bit more about the books.
Certainly, our mantra, as it were, is 10% braver. Women do often have an issue with confidence or being brave, not because that's how women are, but because that's the stereotyping that we've grown up with and expected to be like that. So what we say is to become, to gain promotion, to advocate for your own flexible working, you just need to be 10% braver. You just need to take one step forward, test that out, see how that feels. And if you haven't died as a result of that, then let's take the next step forward as well. Let's go as well forward. And each time women are 10% braver, we ask them to celebrate with us on Twitter or on Facebook or by email in whatever way. And that has resonated so much with women and an awful lot of men that became the focus of our first book, 10% Braver, inspiring women to lead education. Because women should lead education because they're 75% of the workforce. And at the moment, they're not leading education. So in the book, we share all of our learning of having worked with so many global women over 5-6 years, and tackle the key issues in the first book. And in the second book, we have women describing how they have been 10% braver. Lizana has written a wonderful chapter within our book, and all our books are written by members of the Women-Ed community. So 10% braver is the first, and being 10% braver is the second. And we are on the verge of making the decision to do a third book, which might kill us even more than the other two. But we think we'd like to do that because we think there's still more to say with the voices of women in our community.
That's very exciting, because that gives us something else to buy for Christmas, because I bought everyone a Christmas present. They're always women.
Talking of Christmas presents, we think every woman in education should buy every male head one of our books.
Absolutely.
And then quiz them on it.
Yes, I agree. And I think even if I could add to this, in higher education, it's really interesting because there we also have the percentages reflected even lower in terms of women becoming professors, for example. And then if we even look at Black professors in universities, women don't necessarily feature. I think it's something like 3% if we're lucky. So again, there's a lot more work to be done, but it comes back to that self-efficacy issue. And that's why the mantra is so important, because it's just small steps every day that gets you there.
Yes, we challenge individual women to break the bias against stereotypes. We challenge organisations to support their women more equitably. And then we challenge the system itself. So we try and work on those 3 levels.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Viv. I know you have a train to catch.
I do.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will also share the recording out far and wide. And no doubt people will watch this and also want to ask more questions, and I'll send them your way.
Thank you very much. And do say hello on Twitter if you're on Twitter. That would be great. Join in the Women-Ed community. And that's men and women. We've got some brilliant he for she's who are making a real difference in their own schools for their female colleagues. So it's for everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Brilliant. Thanks for being here. And we're looking forward to collaborating with you in the future as well at the university. Thanks, Viv.
Bye-bye.
Speak to you soon. Bye-bye. Lovely. Thank you to Vivian for giving up her time. I know how busy she is. She's literally hopping on a train right now. And our next speaker is then Sean Starr. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sean. Sean is one of our esteemed colleagues at the university, and he's going to share with you his leadership journey, because he also recently completed his doctorate focusing on leadership in education. So Sean, I will make you a co-host. and then you will be able to share your slides and also talk to us more about then your journey and your work that you are doing in terms of leadership.
Thank you very much. I should be able to share my screen, I hope. Share screen. Forgive me, folks.
Okay. We can see it. That's great. Thank you.
Excellent. So I am going to refer to my doctorate, but my particular focus in this session is around the importance of creative leadership and what I mean by creative leadership in the current context of education within the mainly in the English system. And I appreciate many of you I've worked with for a number of years now on the MPQs, and hopefully that will continue. So, oh, is that not right? There we go. So I think context is important. You know, the presentations we've had over the last, well, since Monday, you know, any leadership or any form of leadership, any activities within one form of education won't necessarily be transferable. It's how we reflect upon that. And I think it's important that we continue to reflect on schooling and its leadership, because it's often argued that schools are not necessarily prepared for the future, with most schools built for purposes and contexts that are either disappearing or actually no longer exist. Furthermore, the educational reform movement in England is placing intense pressure on schools to engage in systematic change to increase educational expectations, overall student achievement and attainment levels, while not necessarily having the additional funds or the resources to support that agenda. You know, this standards-driven agenda is the dominant force influencing the different directions schools are taking now. And that's not necessarily the English system. That's a lot of neoliberal systems within within the world, across the globe. This agenda is centered on the continuous drive for improvement, reflecting on the ideological stances of consecutive governments, and therefore has increased the number of actors within the system. Whether you're looking at multi-academy trusts, whether you're looking at foundation, federated schools, whether you're looking at regional schools commissioner, whether you're looking at Ofsted, you know, all these additional actors within the system have an impact. Therefore, the continuing influence of the standards agenda can be viewed as not saying what needs to be achieved, but what will be measured. But there isn't a clear blueprint necessarily of processes or actions that will fix that particular agenda item. Such a school system arguably is marked by a change of, I suppose, a focus from inputs to the system to outcomes and accountability within the system. And therefore, we need to reflect upon you know, this rationalisation and decline of resources within the educational system. You know, strategies can potentially be achieved through different leadership and management of change, using philosophies and tools from both school and non-school context. School leaders, I suppose, are required to explore approaches to maximise efficiency and effectiveness. And you know, we hear these words quite a lot: efficiency and effective. How are we being efficient? How are we being effective? The leading and management of these change processes are focused on self-improvement, yes, school support, while also concentrating on local level autonomy and direct accountability. Working with school leader teams on these processes provided, for me, a very useful insight into school improvement, school effectiveness. And my research was very interested around models that, or the current situation, and models that could support continuous improvement. And an element of that is around creative leadership. So using leadership models that are broader than the roots of origin. You know, a while now, in 2005, Michael Fullan recognised that education system must become able to transform, respond to changing situations and requirements, which brings about their own continuing transformation to ultimately to ensure sustainability and the ability, that moral compass, that moral purpose to support the communities which the schools serve. Fullan further defines such, I suppose, sustainability as the capacity of a system to engage in the complexity of continuous improvement consistently with the deep values of human purpose. Education ultimately is not an exact science. It is diverse, it's complex, it's the environment in which schools work is subjective and involves values, which often leads to multiple perspectives of how quality of education should be defined. Within that agenda of, I suppose, a system that is volatile, complex, often ambiguous, I suppose ultimately uncertain with changes. So what I did, or what I spoke to 6 schools, interestingly 3 primary and 3 secondary. And I asked them to reflect upon their position at their school and their leadership position within the current educational climate. Now, this research did happen pre-pandemic, so obviously the additional complexity associated with the pandemic wasn't necessarily represented. But for me, there are certain elements within this these pictures, these rich pictures, that is consistent, irrespective whether you're a primary or secondary school leader or phase. And I just want to point some of those key points out, if that's okay. So I've got my red pen. Yeah, ultimately, the leader themselves, and this may come when we start talking about creative leadership a bit further, still on the whole see themselves at the very top of this triangle, sharing and supporting. And that's not necessarily a negative thing being at the top necessarily, but about delegation, about supporting their staff to be able to achieve the outcomes. While, and in this particular, this is a primary school, by the way, while having it, and that represents an ear. So the head teacher in this particular school was about listen to the pupils, listen to staff, listen to the community, listen to the parents, to inform their practice and to make sure their school was being responsive to the community needs and serving the community, while having what this particular head teacher says 2020 vision, having that idea of what's going on beyond the school itself. And then they represented themselves as umbrellas. And I'll come back to the umbrella in a moment, because there's another slide I want to share with that. And then you've also got the dark clouds. I emphasize dark in this particular aspect of the government, and that raining down onto the school with the head teacher there, protecting, filtering, being the defender of the school. And in this particular school, the head teacher saw the local authority as a white cloud, as supportive. Not all schools saw the LA as that, but that you could see within this situation there's complexity. You've also got this dog and these sheep, and I'm going to come back to those again in a moment. Because when we start looking at other pictures, and I did this one as just an example of what a whole picture looks like, then I've broken some down. So interestingly, this is the same picture that was just in the previous diagram, the rich picture. And this is another head teacher, obviously. This is from a secondary school. And for me, that the fact that they've got these very symbolic representation of these umbrellas. Now, whether they're umbrellas in terms of a shield or from the rain that's coming down, or trying to filter the relevant staff. If any of you seen The Kingsman, that umbrella is also quite an effective weapon as well. But you can see that they're trying to stop or filter Ofsted and protect their school from Ofsted, from trying tests and data. And in this particular school, this head teacher also had a sword to even sort of counteract some of these policies that are happening within schools. It's a very creative approach. And then we've got these dark, like I said, these dark clouds. And again, this dark cloud of Ofsted and Ofsted preparation. And some schools that I was involved with were worried about academization and what that were meant for them, for their school, for their community in the longer term. And as I said earlier, this wolf, which actually represents in this example as Ofsted, looking at corralling staff and pupils, and this head teacher talked about sheep, rather than working with, directing and pulling and threatening, I suppose, ultimately. And again, so that's a primary example. This is a secondary example. And obviously the relationship with the local authority in this example, this particular school, wasn't so positive, but they're worried about the DFE, they're worried about Ofsted, and they represented that as the shark. So we can see that there's these threats, these perceived threats to the system with the current leadership models, with the current processes. So ultimately, school leaders, no matter what level you're at within the school system, are leading in very challenging times. And ultimately, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the fore a primary modus operandi of a very conservative, very hierarchical leadership of many schools across the globe, not necessarily within England, but across the globe. And if we think about that picture that I showed you, the whole picture where the head teacher being at the top, saying this is how you're doing it, this is why you're doing it, reinforced by, I suppose, imperative statements, hashtags, I suppose, is the order of the day. And ultimately, to certainly about crisis management within a fast acting and immediate processes, and trying to mitigate against measures, and the head teacher seeing them as this filter to stop and support staff and to reduce the impact on young people amidst times of uncertainty, limited clarity, and ultimately systemic instability. However, this style of leadership could be considered very dictatorship, and if not fueled by underlying empathy and understanding the complexity of the problem and solutions, could become quite draconian. The school leaders and government ascribe to empathy being an essential first step in developing clarity regarding the way forward. The leadership, the leaders I work with and leaders I'm sure in this room have begun to get more traction. This model of which is aligned with creativity and creative thinking. This emergence is driven by the need to bring about immediate day-to-day operative and strategic solutions that directly relate to improving personal experiences and need to be part of the solution to have positive outcomes on children and young people. And this is an area that I would like to, I suppose, reflect upon what's left of my time in this presentation. For me, and just taking a step back, from my research, there are 5 strategic drivers: having a clear purpose, a clear process, the leadership associated with that, having the right people, the right support for those people, and the right culture. Matt Silver on Tuesday talked about the purpose and having your purpose. And it's just obviously coincidence that this was a key argument in my thesis, in my research. Actually, do school leaders have a clear understanding of their purpose within the system? And leadership, for me, is the keystone for supporting and developing the other 4 areas, though there is a significant overlay and intertwining within the system. So looking at leadership typologies that are out there and taking the opportunity to reflect on leadership. Leadership theories have been around since storytelling was created. Theories and principles that would have withstood centuries range from Plato's dialogue on leadership. The heaviest penalty for declining to rule is to be ruled by someone inferior to yourself, or being more Machiavellian. It's better to be feared than loved. Or on the polar side of that, Lao Tzu's idea of a leader's best when people barely know they exist, and when their work is done, their aim fulfilled, they will say, we did it ourselves. So the ideas are more influencing. And then you suppose in the early 20th century, we've got this scientific management focus on leadership aimed at maximizing employees' efficiency and effectiveness. And this idea of a great man theory, this one person, this heroic leader, and that leaders were born and not made. And arguably that theory now no longer having any valid or validity within the system, because we understand that the characteristics of leadership is wider and broader. Moving on to the 30s with Lewin looking at organizational leadership styles of autocratic, democratic, and I know within your MBQs and within leadership, research, you're all very familiar with these. 30 years later, Leichhardt talked about his participative leadership. Hersey and Blanchard posed this situation leadership. Ultimately, we can see leadership as a process, and it's not fixed. And everybody has the ability to be a leader. And as such, leadership for me is about influencing people and providing an environment for them to achieve personal, team, and organizational objectives. And creative leadership, to a degree, it is no different, except creative leadership goes beyond the process, for me, into a philosophy and an act. It develops and realizes innovative ideas through the shared ambition of improving the organization, through enterprise. Those who employ creative leadership do so by forging an environment, a culture that promotes creativity, innovation, experimentation, and entrepreneurship. And from my research, arguably, that experimentation and entrepreneurship wasn't always evident. This philosophy actually has been, you could argue, is developed from the idea of that transformational leader, or that authentic leadership. And think about what Alana said yesterday about being authentic to yourself. That creative leader is authentic to themselves. But for me, creative leadership goes further by understanding the interdependency and intradependency of actions on larger organizational ecosystems, refraining competition into collaborative relationships, and treating experimentation, failure, and learning as an implicit state rather than a reward structure or a failure structure. Creative leaders feel, I suppose, a need for continual improvement and change. And arguably within education, the only thing that is consistent is change. Nevertheless, leaders, for me, need to allow people around them to feel safe about that change. That focus on people is imperative. This suggests a wider need for personal and organizational development and a balance of human technology factors, having those values centered around, I suppose, actually rather than centered around, removing that idea of top-down hierarchical and reliant on those solid structures and levels of leadership and management. There needs to be a more form of quiet leadership centered on people as a living body of organization. And again, for me, this leads to a tripartite process of empathy, clarity, and creativity, based on the principles that everyone has the leadership potential. Creativity can be defined as universal ability to develop solutions that positively impact on others and ourselves and others, with empathy being the hallmark of a 21st century leader. So with this empathy, clarity, and creativity, it is essential that these values allowed us to adapt to the volatile, the uncertainty, the complexity, the ambiguous nature of leading schools and leading complex organizations, particularly notwithstanding the current pandemic. Therefore, exploring solutions to complex problems. Nevertheless, creative leadership is not about problem solving per se. It's about finding better solutions and looking for those solutions, and always involves problem finding or identification, actively scanning the environment for challenges So it's using that 2020 vision, which that head teacher put in early on in their diagram or their picture. So it's not necessarily what's addressed now, but what could derail improvements, prevent schools from engaging, change, or disrupting that school system. In such a culture needs to be an accepted experimentation within your organisation. If you looked at many of the MPQ projects that you've undertaken, that other colleagues are undertaking, it's very much about experimentation. When you started your leadership journey, you have no idea whether your project was going to be a success, but you experimented, and that is, for me, is fundamental for creative leadership. But it's also being the awareness of being flexible, and the change, and the fact that sometimes you need to change direction if required. So it's understanding that ultimately there is no destination. Leadership is just the journey, and it's actually embracing the fact that you're never going to get to the end, and that can be quite scary. So when comparing leadership thinking and more traditional thinking approaches, you've got the idea of applying innovative thinking to leadership tasks by creating a client where others are applying. So it's supporting the growth of everybody and everybody's leadership, therefore not top down. And I think for me, I've spoken to many school leaders, many head teachers, many CEOs, and they say, we're not top down, but we've got an open door policy. But the fact that someone's got to come to speak to you to get approval, potentially about doing activity, there is still that element of top-down approach. So though having an open door policy is admirable, and I'm not trying to dismiss that, but actually think about the reasons why there's an open door policy, and moving around to more of a different type of reasoning, whether it's deductive, or inductive. So going from deductive, going from a general rule and coming to a specific conclusion, or an inductive, coming from observations to generalizations. You need to move to what's called abductive reasoning. The ability to start inferring reasoning from incomplete set of observations, and then start to reflect on the likeliest possible explanation for those results. And therefore, with the ability to be flexible and change when you consider, or the leader considers, things are not going in the right direction. This allows creative leadership to be constructed on the foundational premise that everyone is a leader, and our whole lives are filled with the opportunities for leadership growth. This perspective is especially empowering and timely in confronting the complexity of pan and post COVID-19, with uncertainty coupled with precariousness, giving rise to desperate need for empathy, clarity, and creativity to address the reality and looming threats of demise, collapse, chaos, and arguably finger in dike scenarios to try to plug those gaps. In the long term, it's not going to be sufficient just to put your finger in the dike as such. Therefore, even during these times of comparative stability, social systems are in continuous state of flux. And that's something, even before the pandemic, there was always that uncertainty, that ambiguity, that flux. And for me, the value of creative leadership is the context of organizational development. And Flori and her diagram represents that idea of creative leadership, with the grey triangles around the end being depicted of organizational response to ever-changing, what she defined as PESTLE factors: political, environmental, social, technology, legal and economic factors. With the four-part diagram present the ethos, the enablement and effect mediated by critical creative leadership on the individual and organizational level. And just to re-emphasize, empathy, clarity and creativity are sustaining human factors in themselves. So how do we achieve it? Leaders are those who are accountable and able to assemble teams and to lead them to optimal performance and outcomes. Therefore, an effective leader should recognise the importance of embracing differences in people and knowing how to connect the dots among those differences. You don't necessarily want to surround yourself with individuals who don't necessarily challenge you in a critical way. By challenging you in that critical, creative way, allows you to think, is this the right decision? Are we going in the right direction? Leaders cultivate a workplace environment of continuous improvement, innovation, and it begins with those people who touch the organisation across all areas. And creative leadership is not dependent on the participation of just the SLT. It's buy-in of all staff members that identify how to do things better. You know, what leaders can do with their teams is to foster an environment of innovation, initiative and experimentation. As a leader, you need to trust yourself enough to trust others. Each member of the team must become more transparent. And Vivian mentioned about transparency in her presentation than ever before. As such, each member must trust themselves enough to trust each other. Collaborate and discover. It's just not about working closely together, but it's also about taking leaps of faith. Communicate to learn and challenge. And obviously that's critical. And course correct to perfect. As I said, when you're doing that approach of actually making inferences from partial data, you need to correct sometimes to find the perfect combination of either people on a team. Leaders must be able to course correct anyway, to adapt to new environments, to adapt to new actors within the system. Ultimately, and as Einstein says, you cannot solve a problem from the same consciousness as it was created. I assume it was Einstein, actually, that I'm attributing the quote to him. And to me, this means whenever a situation we're facing, we need to rise up to new consciousness, a new way of thinking creatively. Therefore, it's important for leaders to recognise every team member is unique, and diverse skills foster that diversity, and being inclusive fosters a good working place. To keep team members engaged and willing to innovate, leaders need to create an atmosphere where people are unafraid of criticism. Therefore, critical leadership has innovation as a mindset, experimentation as a mindset, and that improves over time. And uses evaluation tools, self-evaluation process to explore multiple possibilities. And though it's sometimes very difficult, a bad experience is a good opportunity to learn from negative experiences and to change something good. And ultimate leaders, your role models. How you lead is so important. And I will end on, I've probably gone over my limit, so I'm sorry, Lizanne. Ed de Bono. There's no doubt that creativity is the most important human resource of all. Without creativity, there would be no progress, and we'll be forever repeating the same patterns. And I will stop.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sean. Lots of food for thought, and you really certainly emphasised the importance of creativity and innovation, as well as the importance of agency. I want to invite people to ask questions if you have any. Simply put your hand up, your virtual hand, and I shall do my best to facilitate. Can't see any hands yet. I might just pick on someone.
Harsh.
Absolutely. I was really fascinated by the images, Sean, that you've shown us. Really interesting how that's a real perceived sense of threat, that there's sharks and there are wolves, and people felt a real sense of anxiety in terms of the DOB offset and so on. Did the pictures change when you had to talk to them about the pandemic and crisis management, or was that still, a really sort of I would say imminent threat when the pandemic came in? Did that shift? Is there a change, or was it still the most concerning thing?
That's going to be a really difficult question to answer, mainly because those pictures were done before the pandemic. I've not been back. Yeah. But I can imagine, if I'm honest, I would wonder, and this is just me reflecting upon those school leaders, so I suppose I'm speaking for them and I could be speaking out of turn, that the things like the wolf and the dark clouds, whether they will be bigger. Yeah. Because the role of Ofsted, and Ofsted in itself, I think, has made leaps and bounds over the years and trying to be more collaborative in their approaches. So I don't want to be too negative about it, but actually having Ofsted inspections continue during the pandemic, or start up again during the pandemic, I question as a policy. Not to say beyond the safeguarding, if I'm honest. Because there are so many complexities, from absence from staff, from pupil absences, and other, lost learning. Schools were amazing, how quickly, and obviously from my own experience, from my own children, how quickly they responded to trying to deliver a robust education. I can only talk about primary schools because that's where my children are. The response from my child's primary school was amazing. I couldn't fault them, and they moved to online learning or some paper resources. So I can imagine certain things being bigger, not necessarily different, but the proportional representation within the diagrams being slightly different. But that's my assumption.
Thanks for sharing. Because I know John Macklin, Dr. John Macklin is in the room as well. And John and I did a piece of work. Oh gosh, yes, I can see him. We did a piece of work on coaching and how leaders responded to COVID at the time. And what's really interesting from that was that coaching helps leaders to make sense before they could give sense. And it also seemed to have been the case that governors had to really start becoming more operational compared to their strategic role that they normally would have. So it seems like there was a real emphasis shift. And John, jump in if you want to add to that, because this was a piece of work we presented at Balmas. It seemed like there was a more operational function for strategic school leaders compared to what they normally had to have before the pandemic. And I was just wondering if you've noticed similar things.
The role of governance during the pandemic, yeah, I would say, yes, I would say changed. I'm reflecting upon that. Yeah, the input and the expectation of governance going from strategic to operational needed to happen. And again, I'm not sure whether some governing bodies had that either capacity or expertise to support schools in that way. And I wonder, because it's interesting, you got me to reflect on those diagrams. At no point in those diagrams was there mention of governance. And I found that interesting. Now you brought that up. Yeah, actually, it is the fact that actually that was omitted, and they're just the school leaders were thinking about themselves in their environment, but actually the role of governance, you think, would be somewhere. That is really interesting. Really interesting to chew on that and reflect. That is, yes.
Fantastic. And I can see that Paul Gould has got a comment there. Paul, do you just want to contribute? And also I can see John's got his microphone on.
John wants to say something.
John, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to jump in on the top of Paul G's comment and something that was just said. Yeah, Paul. It seems like Paul hasn't got a mic, so he can't talk. So I'll try and do him justice. I think the thing that Paul was getting at, and I found from my research, is sometimes it's the threat level, and sometimes the turbulence and threat level will indicate your response. So if you feel that the threat's significant and immediate, you take urgent and critical. You say, let's do this right now. Let's do that. So you don't create that space for creativity because you're always feeling under threat. When you think that you've got some space, then you start to engage and co-create and start working with others to develop a solution. And that became about the threat level. And I think your comments around Ofsted, if you perceive Ofsted as an immediate threat all the time, that's likely to inform how you respond to things, and you're always going to be responding like everything's urgent, must be dealt with right away. It's always in a bit of a panic, so you never create that opportunity for creativity and longer term learning, because you're in a starting state of fear and panic. And I think that's true of any leader. And I think what myself and Lizana found during doing our coaching thing about the pandemic is that sense of urgency and immediacy, and I must get this right, must do that you know, decisions weren't discussed. We've got to do this. Yep. There might have been some discussion, but there wasn't as much sense giving and sense making in time to bring people with us. We've got to do this now. And that can stifle creativity, I think.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, and it was almost as if there was that moment where what could have caused the sense of urgency. And with the pandemic, there was that sense of urgency that pulled the team together into that, you know, collaborative space where things just happened. But, you know, with all the sort of unclear policy directives and things, leaders had to talk to someone, and that's where governors came in. They had to digest it with them to then make sense, make sense and then give sense, and then be directive in terms of next steps. So it was a really interesting dynamic, which is really unusual in comparison to how we would normally operate. So the pandemic really changed the way things had to happen. But it seems like as we are now starting to, and I feel really uncomfortable saying this, live with the pandemic, we move back into normal ways of working, whatever that might look like.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add, Sean?
No, fine. No.
I think I'm looking, I'm really, thank you very much for the opportunity, Lizana.
Thank you for sharing your research with us. I've always wanted to know what it looks like and what came out of it, so I really appreciate that. And also thank you for being so generous with your time. Super. Well, and as John's microphone is already unmuted, brilliant, I'm going to hand over to Dr. John Macklin from the University of East London. And as you can tell, John and I have worked together for quite some time. And John is going to talk to us about leadership and neurodiversity. John, I will make you a co-host, and then you'll be able to share your slides.
Oh, that's going to be a step too far for me, I'm afraid. Right.
There's a share screen. It's a green button. If you click on that.
Yep.
And then just select your screen.
I've got it there.
Brilliant. We can see it. Brilliant.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Oh, can everyone see that clearly? Because I tend to prefer it in this view when I'm presenting, because that's to do with how my brain works. So if I just move
we
that,
can see it. It's absolutely fine.
Clearly. Yeah. Okay. Great. Right. So neurodivergent leader and colleagues. Now, you're probably, some of you that can see me will see that I'm sitting here with a pair of glasses on, and I'm not trying to style things out. This is purely because part of my specific learning difficulty is I also have a visual stress, and for me, the new way of working, where I'm spending so much more time online and presenting online, is causing my eyes to be quite sore. So at the moment, I'm sitting here talking to you, and if it's possible to describe a headache of the eyes, imagine having a headache, but the headache just being on your eyes. That's exactly how I'm feeling right now. So changing work patterns have caused me quite a little bit of discomfort, and I'm awaiting some new, as I call them, special needs glasses that allow my eyes not to get so fatigued and tired so early. But as you can see, this is me. I'm the co-chair of the Dyspraxia Foundation Education Panel, and I've got loads of letters after my name that only those people that are interested in these sorts of things know what they are. But it sort of indicates that someone like myself, who does count as neurodivergent and neurodiverse, can achieve. And we'll talk about this issue about, well, how have I managed to get this far? And so many others have not. And it's quite an interesting point, really. But we're going to look at this issue. We're going to look at what neurodivergent is. We'll look at neurodivergent leadership. And then we'll look at working with neurodivergent colleagues. And there's similarities and overlaps and differences. But let's get to the issues first. So most people count as neurotypical. And what I mean by neurotypical is the fact that they don't have to question why they're thinking in a certain ways or why things are happening, or really struggle as often to make sense of things. So someone like myself who's neurodivergent or untypical, I've spent a lot of my life being in situations where it doesn't really quite make sense. And I always feel a little bit unusual, ill at ease, can feel overwhelmed. Where that's been good for someone like me is it then means that when I'm in a new situation, I'm used to those feelings of feeling slightly overwhelmed, not knowing what I'm doing. It doesn't make sense. Am I being clear for everyone? So I've got all those questions going on in my mind at the same time. So therefore, it means that I can sometimes adapt to new situations where sometimes neurotypical people have got used to performing well in certain contexts and they don't always adapt to new contexts as readily as someone that could be neurodiverse. But conversely, sometimes neurodiverse people can be so overwhelmed by new situations that they're not able to function. And that can happen to me. Now, mine happens in particular ways where I just get immediate feelings of just being completely overwhelmed. And it functions in a sense of, if you imagine you've seen your computer screens where, you know, you get if you're a Mac user like me, you get the little spinning ball of death. And if you think about an old Microsoft computer, you used to get that little egg timer used to spin around. And essentially what that was saying was that computer cannot process any more bits of software or actions or things. You just have to let it wait and settle down. And in a sense, that's a bit like people like me. We get to a point where we can be, our cognitive load, the Sweller calls it, gets so maxed out that we can't function and everything just freezes and stops. And that's when you can start feeling completely overwhelmed. And so then it's knowing how to work with colleagues that can feel like that, and then actually thinking about how to help them move forward. So that's what we'll be talking about. So the neurotypical aren't presented with challenges about trying to make sense of things and trying to understanding things all the time, because it seems quite straightforward and obvious. So a particular challenge for me when I was young, we don't do this now. This is aging me, isn't it? We tend to go, if we want to order a takeaway, we tend to go to Deliveroo or one of the other apps. Well, I don't, but somebody else in the house does. But when my kids were younger, like 8 and 9, we didn't use those things then. I used to have to get them to ring for takeaways, because managing a phone conversation, holding a phone and holding a pen and ticking off the list of that I was given to read out by the family could sometimes be too difficult for me. Now, that can be quite a straightforward task for many people, but too challenging for me. So that's what can make it interesting, challenging, working with people like myself that count as neurodiverse, because often, we come with other challenges. So what we need to be doing is moving forward and working in a way where we accept that other people will function, will work, will need to be managed, developed, spoken to in slightly different ways, and also given praise for slightly different things because of the nature of who they are, because they might need a little bit more reassurance at times. So neurodiversity is moving away from just knowing that there's someone who is neurodiverse, but actually bringing it on board and working with them and developing them, and actually thinking this diversity can actually add to my organization. And it links back to the previous talk about creativity, because as I'm going to talk about later on, often the people who are neurodiverse, they see things from a slightly different perspective. And if I illustrate this with Bertrand Russell's book Analysis of the Mind, 1934, where he talks about a table, and depending upon your perspective, you see the table differently. So imagine you'd never seen a table before. There's a few people around this table and they're all describing the table from their perspective. So someone's looking at it from the side and they say that flat surface has got 2 legs. Somebody's seeing it from a slightly different angle and say that flat surface has got 3 legs. Somebody's looking at that table from above and they can't see any legs. And they say there's no legs. It's just a square or a rectangle or oblong, whatever you want to say. And so that's about your perspective. Now, what can happen is when you're working with someone who's neurodiverse, they will sometimes bring something to the discussion that's not immediately evident, and it can seem a bit quirky, like why have they said that? So think about the fact that people are bringing some different perspectives, and the benefit of thinking about those different perspectives is it stops us going down that group thing that they studied in the Cuban Missile Crisis from 1968, which is relevant to our thinking now in terms of what sadly is happening in Ukraine, where the Americans were making lots of missteps in their work with and attempts to stop the Russians, or the Soviet Union then, putting missiles in Cuba. And that's because they looked at it. All of the advisors of President Kennedy went to the same university, lived in the same neighborhood, went to the same sorts of schools, went to the same, like gyms and clubs and all those sort of things. And they were too similar. And because they were too similar, there was no challenge to their thinking and different ways of thinking about things. However, when we think about leadership, and particularly when we talk about the last talk and the point that myself and Lizana raised about urgency and challenge, that sometimes leaders don't want to be challenged and they don't want anyone to be questioning their actions because this is the right way to do things. And this is where I think it's quite useful as someone with neurodiversity, because you have to think differently. I like this. You're lucky, when I'm teaching students about neurodiversity, I normally sing this song from UB40. That gives my age away because I am in my mid-50s. So I remember UB40, and there's a great song they sang about 1 in 10, which is linked to the unemployment figures at the time in the UK. But what there is some data says that there's lots of people that are neurodiverse. Some people indicate that it can be as many as 1 in 10, and that counts people like autism, people with ADHD and SBRDs. I've put my own one there, dyspraxia, because when we think about specific learning difficulties, most people go, oh, dyslexia, and they don't think about dyspraxia or dyscalculia, and therefore mine tends to be overlooked. And that's why I've got it. Nobody knows it, but I'm always there. And it means that we need to think, that many people. But then we need to think, well, actually, not many people with specific learning difficulties, ADHD or autism, make it to become doctors of education and manage a department of 70 staff with 8 professors in. So why is that? Well, there's a significant number of people like myself in prison. There's a significant number of people like myself that don't make it through the education system. And so what happens is when you meet people like me in our world, there's very few of us because most of us haven't made it through the system. And that's quite a challenge for us when we think about how we need to work and how we need to educate people, because what tends to happen, we tend to filter them out into other activities or to non-activities when you only think about people that end up being in the prison system. But this is what I do, leaders who know they are neurodiverse. And I'm talking about leaders who know because I didn't know until I was 47, So there's lots of other people out there that may not know that they've got a specific learning difficulty that then also links to the fact that they're very likely to be neurodiverse in their thinking. So when I was 47, wow, what a shock. I mean, I really didn't want to know that I was dyspraxic. I only found out because by perchance, like a good educationalist, I was learning how to work with people that have dyslexia. And out of curiosity, I went to our disability team at the university and said, can I just take your provisional test to see what people go through so I can know what students might be faced with when they have to do these things? And lo and behold, it flagged up that I had dyslexia. So I had to go get a test. And well, it was a 3-hour test in total, but the educational psychologist said within minutes that I didn't have dyslexia. I tried to leave, but they kept me there and made me do loads of other tests. And I left being a dyspraxic. I went in as a dyspraxic, but came out knowing I was a dyspraxic. There's a slight difference there. But then I had to go on a learning journey about myself. But what I've learned about my dyspraxia and working with others, and it comes back to a point that Lizana mentioned, we quite like Wick's 1995 thinking around sense making and sense giving. So for me, I think as a leader, I need to give sense. So I need to sometimes think very carefully about how I've got to a conclusion and actually fill in the gaps, where sometimes you can think when I'm looking and trying to work out what the so-called neurotypical do, it seems like they can come to a conclusion and everyone seems to know, yeah, that's the right conclusion. That's the conclusion I would have come to. But sometimes when you're neurodiverse, you come to a quirky or unusual conclusion and people think, what are you talking about? And look at you like you're a bit odd. Might be, there's always some people in the room who go, I know what you're getting at, but you get a significant number of, quizzical looks. So then you have to go back and think, I need to explain how I've got to this conclusion. So there's sense giving, you're giving sense to people. Then you need to create an opportunity for people to make sense of it, to think, well, actually, that's not how I was thinking about it. I'm now seeing how John's thinking about it. Let me try and process that and make sense of it, to actually think, does it make sense? Now, that's because I like to be challenged. I like people to question whether I've come up with the right answer or whether it is the right solution. But I can only get people to challenge me if I give them a chance to make sense of what I've been saying. But I have to be the sense giver. I can't always make the assumption that everyone will immediately follow and understand the conclusions I've drawn or the argument I'm making without filling in the backstory. And I think overall that's quite a good thing. And I think that's good for everyone, because, you know, people think, oh, I know, I understand. And where that helps, I think, in my leadership is, as you know, you're probably doing it now. I've done it. You sort of almost drift in and out of consciousness when you're in a meeting or listening to someone, or you get distracted, or you're thinking about, you know, as I'm doing, you know, as you might do, think about your dog Angus. And so you don't always pay full attention to what's going on. So if someone can actually go back and think, well, I've got to this conclusion because of this and that and this, you think, makes sense. I get what's going on now. And so that helps people move forward, because often we've been in situations where we've been at an event or a meeting and it's taken place and we've left, and we try and make sense of it through those snatched conversations as we leave the meeting. What I found for myself in that situation, the online world doesn't allow for those little snatched conversations as you're going out of a meeting, as you go to get a coffee, as you check that you've understood it correctly, because you normally just close down, you leave and you go to another meeting. So those opportunities have changed when you think the difference between the online and the virtual world. So this is a bit I was just saying about the conclusions. I need to take people on a journey, and I need to let people know that my journey is not linear. It's a network journey. I see the connection. So for me, what makes my point of view more robust is about the fact that it links to so many other thoughts and ideas and philosophies. So I don't tend to be one of those people that there's, oh, this is the answer. I tend to do much more, as they call it, like it's like M theory, map theory, where you need more than one map and laying maps to actually see the point of view. And that comes back to the idea about you know, Bertrand Russell's table, making sure you've seen all aspects of the table, below, above, from the side, and tested how strong it is, for example. And that's a case of then thinking, oh, now I've got a fuller picture. I can do that. I can go on this journey. But it's also letting people know that I often connect things together. So it means that I've thought that links to this, that links to that brings this to so that's where I am. Now, like all people, that doesn't mean that my conclusions are better or correct. It just means I can explain how I've got to my conclusion. And then people can say, I know you've got to it, but that bit's wrong. And I like that bit. Oh yeah, that bit's correct. And then you can move forward and work together. Where when it comes to working with colleagues, it's a slightly different ball game altogether. When you're working with colleagues, is again, you've got this issue about, does the colleague know? Yes or no? Then we've got this other thing that tends to happen quite often in education, where people can be labelled. People can be labelled as having something when they may not have a diagnosis or actually been tested for it. So I can often be in a situation where I talk about my dyspraxia, and then I have other people say, oh yeah, come to me after and say, yeah, I've got dyslexia, I've got dyscalculia, I've got, and I say, well, have you had a test? And they go, no. And I say, well, how do you know? You know, and I think that's quite an important thing, because often we can find students are labelled and that label stays with them, and it changes their self-perception. It changes how they think they can achieve or work. So one of the things that needs to happen is, you know, people need to actually have a proper test to actually indicate if they've got a specific learning difficulty, and then you need to think about them being neurodiverse. Now that doesn't mean that it's only those with ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dyslexia that tend to be neurodiverse, but it's more likely that that group's going to be neurodiverse because their brains process things slightly differently. For example, when it comes to hearing, my hearing's really great. My eyesight's really good, actually. I don't really need prescription lenses, but it's my brain's ability to process that information that becomes much more of a challenge. So often I have to be in situations where I have to think about the room acoustically. What's been a particular challenge for me, and will be for other colleagues, is when I've been teaching students and they've been sitting in my room with masks, I've often had to apologize and had to say, can I stand closer to you? Because I often have to use the visual aid of someone's mouth moving to actually know what they're saying to me, and I can't always do it otherwise. When I was younger, I used to think I was just useless in nightclubs because I could never make sense, because I was never able to make sense of what people near me were saying. And I realize now that's because I can't process and differentiate the sounds, rather than the fact that there was a problem with my hearing and the fact that I probably was a bit of a, a bit of a muppet, to be honest. But let's move on from me being a bit odd. But it's mainly a case of that was a sound processing issue. And then you can find that with colleagues that they process sounds, they process light, they process ideas differently, and it functions slightly different in their minds. And one of the things you need to bear in mind, if you have colleagues that then become diagnosed as having dyspraxia, dyscalculia, one of the others, it counts as a disability, and then you need to make reasonable adjustments. And in our world of education, reasonable adjustments can be quite difficult. So the typical one that tends to be given out when you go for an OH appointment is they give you 25% extra. Why 25 and not 19% or 30%? I don't know. But you often find that when I talk to students or other colleagues that have got diagnosed with something like dyspraxia or dyscalculia or dyslexia, or they tend to find they've been given extra writing time. And it always tends to be around the 25% mark. Must be some reason, or it's just a random figure that everyone tends to run with. But let's think about that. You've got colleagues that need to get their marking done. Do we think, oh, that person needs 25% extra time? Do we make that reasonable adjustment for them? You've got to write your reports by tomorrow. Well, does that person get tomorrow plus an extra quarter of a day? It doesn't work like that in our world, because deadlines are deadlines, and sometimes as leaders we can't move those deadlines. We just need to know. So then we need to think about, well, actually, how can we work with helping that colleague do it? Now, that means that everyone will find that work can take longer, but for some colleagues that may take longer still. But that doesn't mean it's always like that. And something myself and Lizana have talked about is, we talk about these being neurodiverse as being a bit like having some kryptonite, where there's things you really can't do and you struggle, but there's other things are like superpowers, where you can do them much more readily and much more easily than others. So a typical one will be, people, I've spoken to 3 colleagues that are dyspraxic in recent weeks, making reasonable adjustments for their workloads, for example. And what's become apparent is we all feel quite at ease just wandering into a room and to start talking and explaining ideas and explaining and talking about presentations, where I've met lots of what I would, let's classify them as neurotypical colleagues, that can sometimes go into a panic. Oh no, I can talk to a class of 30, I can't talk to an assembly, or I can't do a lecture of 200. They get in where for people like us, that's, well, okay, yeah, I can do that. And so you find that actually there are things that we're much better at than others, and other things we're not so good at, and that needs to be thought about. But the one thing I've got here is help them make sense of the neurotypical world. I think some things don't quite ring true, or seem to think, well, I can't get that. And sometimes, if you're learning something new and it's too perplexing, you just don't absorb it. And it's about being being emotionally happy. If you're emotionally happy and not overly perplexed, you're more likely to absorb it. And that comes back to Vygotsky's zones of proximal development, where Vygotsky said that you want to push the learner to the edge of their zone of proximal development, because it's at that point that the new learning gets absorbed and takes place. If they're not challenged enough, there's no learning. And if they're over challenged, they're not capable of learning. And what you've got to be careful of is some activities that other people can do quite readily, someone who's neurodiverse might find too challenging and therefore struggle and therefore be so overwhelmed they can't do it. But another thing to do is to help them be sense givers. Often they need to be helped and feel confident at talking to others about how they might need to work and how they might need to learn. And that's quite an interesting thing. I've just thought about this, and I'm going to say this because this just cropped up in a conversation I had this week, is sometimes people that might have, like myself, like a specific learning difficulty and therefore count as disabled and have to identify that on application forms, can sometimes feel that they don't want to talk about it, don't want to explain it to others, because it's almost like they're making excuses. It's almost like saying straight away, look, I'm letting you know now, I'm going to fail at this, but you've got to tolerate me failing at it. And no one likes that. And so that needs to be dealt with in a particular way. You know, how do we get this person to perform at their best? How can we help them? And how can we help them explain it without them feeling like they're always, you know, making excuses? Unique perspectives. That comes back to the point about creativity, because they see the world slightly differently, because they process things slightly differently, and they may make the links or jumps between different ideas in a way that's unusual. That can be quite useful, and it's useful for challenging your plans and ideas. You think, oh, that's an interesting perspective, and just treat it like an interesting perspective. You may need to get them to say, well, can you explain to me how you've come to that conclusion? Because that might be a good idea, but at the moment, it doesn't quite ring true. So you need to help them explain that, what they're doing. Be prepared for challenge. The big issue I always have is I often feel, as I've put on my other slides, that I'm like the boy who points out that the emperor's naked. The trouble is, people like me struggle to stop ourselves saying that the emperor is naked, and it can be quite difficult, and we can sometimes misjudge the room, misjudge the mood about how the people are thinking, because to us it seems quite self-evident, and we don't realize that we need to make sure that everybody else is with us when we make what can appear a random statement. And that's because some people do think much more in a very linear way, which is very useful. You need that linear thinking. You need that sometimes much more methodical thinking to make sure that when somebody comes up with a bit of, let's say, blue sky thinking, as the American cousins say, that there's someone that can actually turn that blue sky idea into operational reality and actually test it and say, well, actually, generally the idea is great, but not the way you envisaged it, because we're going to have to do it like this because of X, Y, Z. So it's a brilliant trait to have, but it might not always be the trait that the neurodiverse person has. They're much better at just coming up with the initial idea and not necessarily be able to fully operationalize it without the support. That links back to being a good leader. I'm just going to mention that point, because as a good leader, if you know your strengths and weaknesses, you build a team around you that covers your weaknesses. So you don't expect your team, you don't have a team of football players and have your goalie playing as a striker. You have your goalie playing as a goalie. So what you make sure when you're a good leader is you make sure you've got the team players around you that can do the things that you can't. And actually that's quite useful. So the first thing I would always want in any of my teams is some people that are good at making things happen, operationalizing things, taking ideas, putting them down, working them through and say, actually, that's not going to work, or that is going to work. That's quite a useful thing to have. But it's also useful to have people that can come up with ideas as well. And so if I'm working with someone else who's neurodiverse, they might come up with an idea. I think, oh, I didn't think of that. I was coming up with this idea. And then we can talk that through. And that's quite a useful thing as well. When you're working with someone who's neurodiverse, and particularly if they've got a specific learning difficulty as well, you might need to break activities down into smaller steps. And that's particularly true for children. You know, sometimes if you're asking people to do something and there's too many steps involved, then they can sometimes struggle and they can't process all those steps because their cognitive load becomes too full. You might need to help them prioritize and manage their diary. I was really lucky when I was teaching. Students used to stop me in the corridor and tell me which room I was going to and what time I was teaching them, which I found very helpful. Particularly helpful when we went to a 2-week timetable, because I had no idea what week I was on. Even though we used to say it every morning in staff briefing, it didn't work. So the kids would say, we're in this room today, sir, we'll see you later. And I go, cheers, thank you, that's really nice of you. So that sort of helpful network was good for me. But you might need to be thinking about, well, actually, this person doesn't value, see, understand, appreciate time in the same way that I appreciate time. And I'm going to give an example from a colleague whose son's 19 and has autism. He's an autistic chap with autism. He still can't tell the time. He doesn't get the time at all. So what's been helpful to him is using his phone and putting alarms in it and alerts so he knows where he needs to go. But he can't look at an analog clock and work out the time, even now. And, you know, many years of trying to do that. Some things just can't get processed. It's that bit doesn't work. So if you imagine the brain as loads of pathways, what can happen in someone's brain that's neurodiverse? The pathway between A and B might be like this. It's all over the place. It's not so straight. So for most people, I'll give an example. If I said 2 + 2, most people go 4. Even I do, you know, most people go 4. Because that's something we've done quite often and quite frequently. So what can happen in a neurotypical world with a neurotypical person? They can lay down much smoother, faster pathways for some activities because they make more sense. Whereas sometimes the neurodiverse or the untypical struggle to make clear pathways about some activities and some actions. But for others, their pathways are much stronger, much clearer, because their brains process information in a slightly different way. So because it processes it in a different way, they've laid down a different pathway. So therefore much more readily able to do some tasks than other tasks. And this is quite an important one. And I found this one myself very difficult to comprehend and difficult with, because it's not one I wanted to admit to. But yeah, I do think, when I look back in my life, I wasn't always able to judge social actions very well, or the social world. And so it did cause me quite a lot of problems. I'm sorry that I've let the light go down quite dark. It's mainly to do with my eyes needing a break. But the social world, misjudging things, getting it wrong. And it's easier to see that when you're thinking about somebody with autism, because people expect that. But that can be true of lots of people that are neurodiverse or also have a specific learning difficulty. And the other one that's very difficult to convince people of is the last one. You can feel more anxious than most and can feel more easily overwhelmed. And I had terrible trouble trying to get my doctoral supervisors to understand that actually doing my doctorate was challenging for me in these ways. And their answer was, well, everyone finds it challenging. And they weren't able to comprehend that some aspects of the work was more challenging for me than other aspects. And you know, Lizana will attest, if we get the chance to ask her, that actually I can talk through ideas really clearly, and I struggle to write ideas very clearly. I still struggle with that logical sequencing of ideas. Where Lizana is absolutely fantastic at writing and putting things down in a logical sequential idea. She's got much better skills at doing that than I have. And that's what we do. So myself and Lizana work together on many research projects and research ideas because our strengths and weaknesses sort of complement one another. But it's only working with someone like Lizana who actually understands that someone like me can feel more anxious about certain things or more challenged. So Lizana won't say, right, we're going to write a research journal together. You do 50% and I do 50%. We tend to split the workload by our skills and by our abilities. And that's quite an interesting way of working, because trying to make me work like other people would cause me too much anxiety and make me feel overwhelmed all the time, and actually make me feel very stressed and anxious. And that's quite a negative thing. Right, I'm going to stop now, and I'm just going to go to stop share. I think I'm clicking on the right thing. Yes, I think I've done that.
Thanks, John. You make me smile because it's true. John is very good at the creative side, and sometimes I need someone to help me distill ideas and come up with creative ways of looking at that. And so what we tend to do with this is that John has to put things on recordings, or sometimes we've agreed he's now going to record things because he can do that quicker and I can touch type, and then we'll pull it together in a more sort of practical way to work through things and move things on. But what's really interesting, John and I also presented at IBDA, we also have an interesting thought on this, is that we also need to develop leaders in our school communities as well as universities to then understand how to work with colleagues with neurodiversity. So what professional development is required to enable people to help them to really work well with us, in terms of then bringing things to life and actually tapping into that creativity. So John, do you want to just say something about that before we take some questions?
Yeah, about the creativity thing. I think as Sean was talking, sometimes creativity and challenge come together. And I think what you've got to accept that when people are doing creative things, there will be challenge and it will be pushed. And to an extent, there's got to be some boundary pushing. And so that's something that we have to learn to understand. What can happen is sometimes pushing boundaries can be seen as a challenge to someone's authority and leadership. And that then, but then again, someone who's neurodiverse or got, particularly if they've got a specific learning difficulty, will not understand that they got to be careful because they think they're being helpful by suggesting, oh, I don't think that's going to work. That's not going to work, because that can actually be seen as undermining the leadership or the leadership's ideas.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that then again creates another set of problems. And then you feel, oh dear, I've done something wrong. You know, then you feel like you're on a naughty step, and like all organizations, you can feel that you're not belonging and not welcome. And it just becomes a vicious cycle there. So it is about, as Sean said, more than just an open door policy, but actually being welcoming and being at ease with others that are different from yourself.
Absolutely. And also perhaps developing people's understanding, as you are doing today, talking about this, sharing it, and also professionally developing people to work with neurodiverse leaders as well. To know that when you push the boundaries, it's not disrespectful, it's just thinking in a different way. Yeah, absolutely. I want to throw it open to colleagues. There's some really lovely comments in the chat as well, John, saying thank you for your contributions. It's been really helpful to help people to understand. And colleagues felt it's been incredibly useful that you're so candid about things. So thank you for that. Any questions from colleagues? Sure.
Yes, John, where would you recommend someone goes to actually learn more about it? Because it never entered, it's very, very, very rude, really. Never entered my head, if that makes sense.
No, it doesn't. And I will be honest, it never entered mine until I found out I was one. You know, I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? I mean, it is a challenge. I think there's a greater understanding that we need to accept neurodiversity, and we like the idea of accepting neurodiversity. And to be honest with you, lots of people like the idea of thinking they're neurodiverse. What we don't often like to try and think about is the fact that neurodiversity might also come with a specific learning difficulty or a disability, and that presents other problems, you know, for challenges for people. So I think the way forward really is to learn about the different, you know, specific learning difficulties and the different and how that manifests in people, and then we can start asking ourselves, well, why is it that so many people with these sort of learning challenges and strengths don't make it into our world? And that's quite a thing. That's something to bear in mind. There is a bit of data that I can't lay my hands on at the moment, but a significant number of people who are dyslexic identify as dyslexic once they get to university. They're not picked up in schools. People who are dyspraxic aren't picked up in schools either. And that's quite an interesting thing. You're more likely to be diagnosed as dyslexic and dyspraxic once you're in a HE setting. But so few people with specific learning difficulties make it to the higher education setting. So that implies there's lots of people not being, you know, appropriately assessed and judged and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And there's that social justice element then, isn't there? Because you're not being inclusive.
Well, yes, but you're not being inclusive because you didn't intentionally.
No, of course.
You know, it's because it's to do with, they call it academic ableism, where your systems and structures are set up to fit the academic able or the academically typical. Therefore, they don't take account of the untypical.
Yeah.
So, for example, we always expect people to present their work and write in a certain way. They don't, you know, if somebody said to me, John, you've got to write a 50,000 word thesis dissertation again, I'd start crying, I think. But this grey hair would be gone. It'd be all out. But if somebody asked me to talk for 50,000 words, no, great. You let me have it. You know. So it's a difference.
Yeah. And could I ask, what did you teach in school, and was there anything associated with, you know, with your?
No, I actually finished my teaching career. I did 14 years in secondary schools in East London. I finished as a computing teacher.
Oh, did you? Computing?
Yes, yeah. Interestingly enough, But I actually learned to be much more methodical, and I actually found having to teach people that made me a much better linear thinker and think about so that was helpful in many ways.
Yeah.
I was also deputy leader of my local council, and that presented problems because, you know, you're in council meetings.
Yep.
And you've made a statement, and you think, I haven't taken people with me on this statement, have I? You all a bit of tumbleweed goes past, and you think, oh dear. Yeah. So lots of I would say that I've spent a lot of my life picking myself up, really. And I think what we need to realize that sometimes picking yourself up all the time can be quite tiring. You know, I mean, I think we need to think about how we make sure people don't fall down as much, but out being there to help them up again is quite a good thing. Yeah.
Thanks so much, John. Lots of comments. Paul also saying thank you so much. It's been a really insightful talk. And then one more question. Let's just go for that one. It's from Maeve. Are there any resources you are aware of to support neurodiverse colleagues?
Not really, no. There isn't. Say there's a set template of things you can do. I think the best way of thinking about it is to think about the brain with lots of pathways inside it. And if you think about the brain as having lots of pathways, it's about how you help them create consistent pathways. So it might be the fact that you know, like the 2+2 example becomes automatic for everyone. That's like it's a motorway pathway in our minds. When you're learning something new for the first time, it can feel very much like you're cutting a pathway through a rainforest where you're not certain you know where you're going. But when you revisit that same journey, you think, oh, I know I went this way because that leaf's been cut and there's my footprint, and it becomes familiar, and it's going over and over, and that same journey then makes it much more familiar to you and much more able to do it. So it might be that there's some activities that that's the dog in the family. The neurodiverse person might need to spend more time going over and over to make sure it's certain in their minds. But the best thing to do is actually think about, well, valuing and praising diversity. And actually, and I would say, after listening to Sean's talk, linking to that idea that they can make our organisation better because it brings that creativity, that newer way of seeing things, that newer thinking. So I now understand why Lizana put my talk after Sean's talk.
Yes, there was a link. Absolutely. I think if I could just add, I mean, I've had the pleasure to work with both of yourselves, but I'm still learning how to work with Sean. But with John, we've spent a lot of time finding out how we work best, and we had a lot of conversations about what works for me, what works for you, how can we connect that and link that up. Lots and lots of finding out, because each neurodiverse person is in fact unique. They all have different ways of working, and it's finding what works for each and everyone. And thankfully, John is very open. He would say, my brain doesn't compute that. I'm not able to digest it at this stage. Could you explain it differently? Or I would say to John, I'm a little overwhelmed. There's a lot going on. I'm not good with chaos. I love things being organized and really systematic, so that I can function. You will notice I have a cleaned up desk policy every day, whereas other people are a bit more chaotic. So it depends on who you work with and finding out how they function. Do you agree, John?
Yes, it is. It's about finding out how they function. So, I mean, I work with a colleague who's dyspraxic and dyslexic. I met another colleague this week who, after meeting me for the first time, got encouraged to go get themselves tested, and has got dyspraxia, dyslexia, and dyscalculia. Right. And okay, we laughed together because I don't often meet people with all three, but it did present her with some work challenges. But it made me think, right, I shouldn't expect her to do a spreadsheet. I will not be expecting that person to grasp because spreadsheets so easily. And if you think about our world in education, we are data driven to a very much extent, and we do present data in spreadsheets. So we need to think about, how do we present that data? How do we make it easier for someone to read? How do we make it easier for someone to put input data on a spreadsheet when it's not something they can readily engage with? So lots of little things like that can help. We all know, for example, that people have a certain reading age and they need a certain font size to match their reading age. What we don't also think about is the fact that people sometimes need space between the lines. So someone like me, I find it much easier to read things when it's double line spacing, particularly online. Single line spacing online is just not going to work for me. I find it very difficult. So double line spacing, it can be useful. And then you might need to think, well, we need to think about how we present the spreadsheet in terms of how the spacing happens, and not expect everyone to fully understand it. And that's another thing to bear in mind. It's how we present data and how we present information to people. So if you want someone to read something very quickly, just think the best rule of thumb is space. The more space there is around something, the easier it is to focus on the thing that's most important. And often we produce documents that are too busy.
Yeah. And it's a case of asking, isn't it? It's maybe asking what kind of questions can we ask people to make sure we've understood what they need from us when we lead them or support them. Because often when you and I work on pieces of work, you would say to me, I need more space. So, you know, I've been developing habits where I would say, is this the right font? Does it work for you? What else can I do?
It's about being a brilliant teacher. I mean, when I work with people, I find teachers are much more able to adapt to this world, because they're much better at asking people whether they've understood something, and then not being upset when that person hasn't understood, but just rephrasing it or redoing it differently. So you find that most people that have been through that are teachers or trained as teachers tend to think and function differently. They're much more welcoming and much more tolerant.
Absolutely. Well, I think, John, that's all we have time for tonight. Right. But thankfully, it's recorded, so we could share it out with colleagues far and wide. And thank you for giving up your time. I know you're super busy in your new role, and I'm hoping you're enjoying the role. Is it head of social science and social work?
Politics, social work, youth work, education studies, early years, and the MA. And professors.
Everything you can think of.
If you're not a professor on here, I'm going to say this: professors can be interesting to manage. Give me neurodiverse any day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, John. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And thank you to all our fantastic speakers. It's been a really jam-packed and insightful conference on our final day. I think, you know, it wraps our key themes really up beautifully. Sean, is there anything you would like to add?
I do actually, Zana. I do indeed. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Colleagues, you may not be aware, this is our 4th year in which we run our leadership conference. The first 2 years we're fortunate enough to have it in person. Obviously last year it was online, and then this year it's online. Again, colleagues may not necessarily be aware, but Lizana has only recently joined us. Was it August, Lizana? Yeah. It was. And Lizana and I met mainly virtually, obviously, and we talked about this conference, and we talked about, and she was really keen. She loved the idea of carrying on with the conference, because realistically, if it wasn't for Lasagna this year, this conference wouldn't have happened. So I would like to really thank Lasagna for putting together an excellent conference. You know, we discussed the format, and then she's just rolled with it. So without her tenaciousness, without her ability to bring all these people together, we wouldn't be here today. And these 4 days, for me anyway, have been exceptional. And I can only say thank you. And yeah, you've done. I'm really, really proud of what we've achieved and what you've achieved. And yeah, I look forward to next year now, Lizana.
That's very kind of you, Sean. But I also want to mention wonderful Sonia, who is always behind the scenes doing a brilliant job supporting us as well. And like you, I'm really looking forward to next year, and hopefully we can have a blended approach of some kind.
That would be nice.
People, but also have an option of online as well. But thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this, because I'm very new, so I'm still learning how it works at the university. And thank you for your mentorship and support.
Yes, and I look forward to seeing you soon. And thank you everybody else.
Thank you.
I'll hand over to you to say the final words.
Super. Well, have a lovely evening, everyone, and we wish you the very best in the future, and we're looking forward to seeing you next year.